Well, thank you guys for coming tonight to our group's kickoff. We are very excited to get things rolling. So my name is Lindsay, and I'm the multi-site and discipleship pastor here. You have probably received several emails from me, so it means it worked. You showed up. That's good. But I'm really glad that you guys are here to kick off our How to Study the Bible group series that we're going to do. So maybe you're wondering, why are we even doing this? I know we have a good representation of groups here. So at the Omaha campus, the groups that are doing the How to Study the Bible study, there's about 20 groups. So there are several groups represented that are going to walk through this together. And the reason we're doing this is because we found in the last several years, we have a lot of new people that are coming to Stonebridge that are figuring out faith. They're deciding to follow Jesus, and they're like, and now I'm supposed to read the Bible, and I'm pretty intimidated by this. It's really difficult. I don't understand it. I started in Genesis, and then I was pretty good for a while, and then I got to Leviticus, and it got real weird real fast. And I don't know what to do about that. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to set our groups up for success, to know how to study the Bible. And even if you've been a Christian a really long time, it's always a good reminder, and there isn't a time I've been in a Bible study about learning how to study the Bible, about reading through a book that I haven't learned something new. So I think this study is truly for everyone. And so I'm really excited to get this going, and I want to talk through what it's going to look like, because I know several of you are new to a small group in general, and you're like, I'm nervous. I showed up tonight, and I don't know what my small group is going to look like. I don't even know who my leader is. As far as your leader, we're going to work on that at the end, so don't worry. You'll get connected to your leader. But the way this is going to work is there's going to be 2 of these gatherings. So you're at the first one, so good job, you made it. And then we'll also have another gathering with all of our groups in October 22nd. But the way it's going to work outside of those gatherings is you're meeting with your small group. So you'll meet with 6 to 12 people. I heard another group has 14, so they got a big group. But you're going to meet typically with 6 to 12 people, and you're going to walk through, you're going to watch a How to Study the Bible video series together. You're going to do weekly readings. So if you're like, I didn't know I was supposed to do that, that's okay. The way it'll work is every week you're going to read a couple of the chapters in John leading up to your group, so that way you're ready to participate in your group. And we actually have a few different ways you can do that. So in the participant guides we gave you, you'll see your daily readings in there. And so when you leave today, you want to start with week 2 to read your week 2 readings to get ready for your group next week. But if you're like, I like things on an app, I don't want physical copies, we actually are using the YouVersion app. So you actually can scan, we should have a QR code up here, or you can search for Stonebridge Christian Church on the YouVersion app, and every week we will post those readings so you can follow along as well. And something different we're doing is it's not new to the church world, is we're going to have memory verses. So if you're like, I have never memorized a verse, I've never done that, well, that's great. This is the time to do this together. So I hope some of you have been working on your John 1 memory verse. And the point is, this isn't we're not going to test you on it unless your leader's super strict. But the reason we're doing this is we want the word to be in your heart. We want you to know when you're going through difficult situations and things, we want you to have scripture on your heart that God can bring up because you haven't memorized, to remind you of truth, things about him. And then you're going to have a time to actually discuss some of the readings that you've gone through, because you might read John and you're like, this is the first time I'm reading this, and I have a lot of questions. That's great. You can write those questions down, bring them to your group, so that way you can have a community to walk through this together. So your groups are going to be super fun, and we hope by the end of this that you know the book of John well, and that you're more comfortable to just read the Bible in general. So to kick us off tonight, Tony Kafka, which some of you may know Tony. If you don't, he used to work at Stonebridge. He is now retired, but still super busy all the time. But Tony has a wealth of information about the Bible and is just very well read and knowledgeable about Scripture. And so we thought he would be a great person to kick off our night. So he's going to walk through some Bible reading principles with you, but really set you up for the book of John as well. So can everyone welcome Tony as he comes forward?
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Lindsay. It's so good to see you. And glad to be here. Some people wonder if I still go to church, since I was always at this campus when I was working here. But my wife, Sandy, and I attend the Millard campus. That's our home, and so we're really glad to be able to be there. I was retired for about 3 months, and Dave Rowe, who goes to the Millard campus, some of you might know him, he said, "So, how do you like retirement?" And I said, "I love it. It's just like high school." And I said, "I do pretty much anything that I want to do, and I hang out with my girlfriend all the time." Yes, sir. And it's all right. And I really kind of want to start with just a glimpse back to my high school, to 16-year-old Tony, because I didn't know Jesus. And my brother, who's a year older than me, invited me to a Bible study for teenagers at somebody's home, and I was a bit of a mess, and other people would have said I was a horrible mess. And it was just a deal where I was just lost. And in a number of months, a year of participating in that Bible study, I began to find out who Jesus was. And I then took my time and read through the whole New Testament before I decided I was going to give my life to Jesus. And I did that. Now you might say, okay, I know you're an overachiever in high school, obviously, if you're reading to do that. But I was really concerned that I didn't want to make a big life step, and it not really be the right one. And so I did that. And so one Sunday afternoon, the guy that was leading that Bible study was a man. I kind of just challenged me and my brother if we would consider finally giving our life to Christ in baptism. And of course, he was this is in the early 70s, and it's like he was just a bit of a rebel anyhow. And so he says, "Let's just go down to the church and do it right now." This is like 2 o'clock in the afternoon or something. And I said, "Great, let's do it," And of course, asking mom wasn't an issue, that wasn't just a thought. And so we do that. Of course, we gather up our girlfriends, that somebody's got to witness this thing happening. And we do that. And we get to the church. Churches were always unlocked. But in that church, the baptistry was locked. Now, it was different design than here, but it was a room in the back, and it had over the stage and that kind of thing. And we couldn't get in there. So, I don't know what we're going to do. And my brother decides, I'm just going to climb up the wall and get in that thing and open up the door from the other side, which is exactly what he did. And so we didn't break into the church, but we broke into the baptistry on that day in order to give our lives to Jesus. And I've not regretted it since. And I am glad to be able to talk to you tonight about things that I had no clue about when I gave my life to Jesus. And so if you're here tonight, and all of us are going to be at different spots. We're going to be at different spots concerning what we know about the Bible. And all I can say is, it's okay, but you don't want to stay there. And that's why the church is giving us this great opportunity. So just give me a second, because I'm going to put a timer on myself here, as if that's going to make any difference. But I just need to do that for my own peace of mind, that I tried at least. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to use, the church is using the microcosm of the Gospel of John to help us kind of walk through some of these tools and also some of the questions that we need to ask from a text. And so let me just get right into it. Zoom out first the Bible. And I at least had someone who told me, start reading in the New Testament. And there was Matthew. Actually, they gave me only a New Testament just to make sure that's what I would do. And so I did that. And that was really a great step. But the whole Bible has different kinds of different kinds of literature in it. There, in the Old Testament, there's the law, and then there's the history books, and then there's the poetry, and some will throw in wisdom at that, and there's the prophecies. And that's the Old Testament. And there's different categories, those are listed. But those are the main ones. And then in the New Testament, you have the Gospels, which is all about Jesus, about the good news about Jesus. You have the book of Acts, which is kind of the history of the early church. Then you have the letters, which are all the things that the church, the leaders passed on to people so that they would know more about how to live the Christian life. And then there is the apocalypse, that's actually the book of Revelation, and that is the prophecy letter. And now there's prophecy through a lot of it and so forth, but those things are helpful as we grow in Bible knowledge and understanding, but they're actually not essential to know right off the bat, because you've probably been listening to the Bible or reading the Bible on your own, and you know that. Now, John's gospel is obviously one of those four in the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Once on staff here at Stonebridge, I might just point out, there actually were 4 pastors on staff who covered those names: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And you say, well, who is John? Well, that's actually my actual name. Tony is my alias, you know. I had one of those experiences that my mother, I was 4th child, no idea. She had no idea at that point she was going to have 8 children total. But at 4, she just said to the nurse, who was a family friend, I don't even know what I'm going to name this one. Which, you know, is a great esteem builder for you when you hear that story. But I've never struggled with realizing that I was the center, the apple of my mom's eye. You know, that's just how she made us all feel. And so the nurse goes, well, name him after his grandpa, which I died a year and a day after my grandfather, Kafka, John Anton Kafka, but call him Tony, because my dad's name was John, and so to differentiate amongst all these Johns in the family, I was called Tony from the day I was born. But staff on Stonebridge, there was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John technically covered right there, and I happened to be the one holding the place for John, and that's what we're discussing in this week's is John. We're going to be growing through it. And so zoom in for a moment. The synoptics, which is a fancy word for Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because they kind of synchronize. Let's just think of that term. They kind of go together, and they have a lot of similarities and stuff like that. They go together, and they were written first. Mark is considered the first one that was written, and it's considered that he wrote Peter's gospel. That is, he became a traveling companion of Peter eventually, and he eventually wrote down Peter's gospel. And Mark's is a fast-paced. You'll find the word immediately in the Gospel of Mark a lot. It's like, this happened, and then immediately this happened, and immediately this happened. That's kind of the pace of that. It's considered it was written for a Roman audience who liked fast-paced things. I always say it's probably the one that Americans should start reading first, because it is kind of a fast-paced gospel. And then you have Matthew, which was written before the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, so sometime before that. And it seems like he was preparing the Jewish believers to realize that there's something more coming than just believing that Jerusalem was going to be the center of the world from that point on. And then Luke, who was Paul's companion and a doctor, he wrote Luke, and he also wrote Acts as kind of like volume 1, volume 2, to maybe give an introduction of Paul to people in the city of Rome, maybe to be part of the defense for Paul as he was facing trial before Caesar. But that was Luke's focus. And then we have John. And John was written last. He wrote it around AD 90. And you think about, well, in AD 30, Jesus started his ministry, and John would have been in that group that he called. And so that means that John was probably close to 90 by the time he wrote this letter. It gives me hope about my future, maybe I still can accomplish something in my life. But every one of these writers has a unique audience. And so John, as we come to that, we begin to see some interesting things. And I think we are ready for our opportunity to zoom in on this. And I think we're going to start with a video, if I remember right. Right. All right. Go for it.
The Gospel according to John. It's one of the earliest accounts of Jesus' life, and we learn at the end of the book that it comes from one of Jesus' closest followers, called the disciple whom Jesus loved. Now, he appears many times in the story itself, and there's some debate about whether it's John the son of Zebedee, one of the 12, or a different John who lived in Jerusalem and was known in the later church as John the Elder. Whichever John it was, the book embodies his eyewitness testimony, and it's been brilliantly designed with a clear purpose that he states near the end. John says, the story is written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, and that by believing you may have life in his name. John believes that the Jesus you read about in this book is alive and real, and that he can change your life forever. The book's design is really cool. Its first half opens with an introductory poem and a short story that's followed by then a big block of stories about Jesus performing miraculous signs that generate increasing controversy. And it all culminates in his greatest sign, the raising of Lazarus, which creates the greatest controversy as Israel's leaders decide to kill Jesus. And that launches into the book's second half. These chapters focus on Jesus' final night and last words to his disciples, which are followed by his arrest, trial, death, and resurrection. The book concludes with an epilogue. In this video, we're just going to focus on the first half. So the book opens with a two-part introduction. First, a poem that begins, "In the beginning was the Word," an obvious allusion to Genesis 1, when God created everything with his word. Now, a person's words, they're distinct from that person, but they're also the embodiment of that person's mind and will. And so John says that God's word was with God, that is distinct. And yet the Word was God, that is divine. And as we ponder this claim, we hear later in the poem that this divine Word became human in Jesus. Then John goes on to draw from the stories of Exodus, saying that Jesus was God's tabernacle in our midst. The glorious divine presence that hovered over the Ark of the Covenant became a human in Jesus. Which leads to his last claim, that the one true God of Israel consists of God the Father and the Son, who has become human to reveal the Father to us. Now, as we consider these mind-bending claims, we then start to hear a story about how John the Baptist first met Jesus, and then led other people to meet him and become his disciples. And one by one, as people encounter Jesus, they say out loud who they think he is. And in this one chapter, Jesus is given 7 titles. Now, these titles prepare us for John's love of sevens in designing the book, but altogether they also make a claim that this fully human Jesus from Nazareth is the Messianic King, he's the teacher of Israel, and he's the Son of God who will die for the sins of the world.
Great summary there. And you go, wow, how do you even know that? Well, you just eventually begin to take it on more. It's like how we get to know people in our families, we get to know our new friends. We begin to hear more and more of their stories. And so in the Gospel of John, we begin to see this big overview of where we're going with it. And so as we think about how we want to not just know the Bible more, really we would miss a huge important aspect. It is really that we are able to take in the truth of the Bible, to memorize pieces of it, all for the sake of becoming transformed people. Romans chapter 12 tells us that we have this transformation of the mind that we can look forward to, and it becomes true in bits and pieces and in little tiny steps. And so that's why we are doing this at Stonebridge, is for transformation of our lives. We may already be believers, we may already have experienced the new life, but we still are going through the transformation. And I just want to encourage you to realize that as we dig into details, we can sometimes think, does this really matter? And in one sense, you don't have to know it, but in another sense, as you begin to really see how God is moving in the lives of people, it really is helpful to see all of these details. So let's keep moving forward with this. Now, first of all, just a little self-promotion, if you don't mind. In my retirement, one of the things that I have is a podcast called Know God, like K-N-O-W. And in that, I have a couple in the first season that kind of match up to things that I'm not going to cover in this, but might be helpful to you. One of them is, it's the third episode, How to Pick a Bible. And the other one is episode 6, which is 5 Principles of Bible Interpretation. Now those, you don't have to look at those, but if you just want to know more, those are sitting out there in podcast land, almost any player that you want to pick it up on. And so as we think about John, it's helpful to step back and say, who was this guy? So authorship and timing of this letter. And we talked about that it was written at 90 A.D., toward the end of his life, but it was written by John, the one that's described in John. He describes himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. Now, the truth is Jesus loved everybody, but John had the same problem that I had, and that is even though I had 5 brothers and 2 sisters, I always thought that mom loved me best, okay? And so John thought that Jesus loved him best. Now, it may have actually been true, but we all can know that we are loved by Jesus. But John was convinced of it so much so that that's how he described himself, you know? And so when I say I was my mom's favorite, my siblings are, you know, it's fighting words, but for me, it's what's in my heart, and that made my mom happy because I can guarantee you that all of my siblings felt like they were the favorite. And that was the nature of the kind of mom that I had. She wasn't perfect, but that is how I felt. And so with John, he described himself that way. It was he wrote the last gospel, so he had the last word. That's pretty cool. And he wrote also then after this, 1st, 2nd, what we call 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, little letters toward the end of the Bible, and then the book of Revelation. So those are all things that John did. So it's a pretty significant little piece of the Bible, especially of the New Testament. It was written in the city of Ephesus, which is in Asia Minor, nowadays Turkey. And that was his last residence. He kind of spent some time in exile at times, exiled by the Roman government to an island called Patmos, where he wrote the book of Revelation and stuff. But he probably died in Ephesus. That was where he aged out. But it was notable at his very end of his life that the dear brothers and sisters that would tend to his needs as an aged person would carry him to church. And he would, on a litter kind of thing, and he would brace himself up, as the record says, and he would just say, "Children, love one another." That was the only message that he gave at that stage of his life. And I would say that that's the guy that is talking to us. Children, love one another. If we don't become more loving because of our involvement with the Bible, we are certainly missing what John intended for us to know. Now, there's some distinctives about John's gospel. There's no birth narrative. In other words, no Bethlehem, all that. But we have, just as it was kind of previewed there with us in the video, there are some things about the existence of Jesus and Jesus coming to earth. But there's no birth narrative. There's no parables in the Gospel of John. There's no exorcisms, no casting out demons in it. Instead, there are some unique stories like the wedding feast at Canaan and the raising of Lazarus, which is mentioned in that, the washing of Jesus' disciples' feet, John 13, on that last half of the gospel, his personal interactions with different ones of the disciples, especially Andrew and Thomas. And John uses the word scriptures more than the other gospels. He would say it's as the scripture said, whereas the other gospel writer might say as Isaiah said, or as it says in the prophet. But John would use the term as the scriptures say. And we might begin to wonder, does that make any difference? I mean, he was writing to Greeks, to Romans, to people that were not believers, but also who maybe were new believers, non-Jewish people, Hellenistic Jews, that is, Jews who were Greek-speaking Jews, because they had grown up in a culture that was a different language than what their native language was. And so Greeks were philosophers, some were hedonists, just like nowadays, people are hedonists, and Romans were pragmatists, which Americans are pragmatists if we're not anything else. If it works, it must be good. And that was a lot of people then, and there were non-Jewish people drawn into the circle of interest in Jesus because the Jewish prophets had some credibility in the general Roman Empire, because the Jews lived in a lot of places in the Roman Empire, and they always said, these prophets are amazing guys. They suffered for their message, they were bold in their message, and they actually said things that actually happened. And with that, I want to just point out that there's a couple distinctives where John writes, "Whoever believes in me, as the scriptures have said, rivers of living water will flow from them." And I like it because it begins to invite non-Jewish people to believe this could be true about them. John 19 has a similar thing, and then in the Greek philosophy, it was mentioned up here, but in the beginning, the first verse of John chapter 1 is, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Now for us, we think, oh, that's really poetic, it's really cool, and I believe it. But I'll tell you what, for a Greek background person, for a Roman, those would have been nearly fighting words. One, you can't have the logos, which was Plato's ideal. That's the Greek word, and that is like, here's the ideal, and then here's the reality of life, and they don't really match. And when he said the ideal message, the ideal messenger, the ideal came to earth, was with God, and it is God, and he came to this earth, because that's what it goes on to say. The Word became flesh, as the older translations say, became human. But he took on flesh. Again, this echoes Philippians chapter 2, takes on flesh and becomes a human being, which is the great mystery of our, it's one of the great mysteries of our faith, that God became flesh and dwelt among us. He doesn't tell about the manger, but he describes what's happening more in the spiritual realm in that birth of Jesus. So he came, he took on flesh. And then, other distinctives about John's record, and I just kind of want to point this out for sure. One of the distinctives is that the one miracle that is in common with John's gospel and the other three gospels is the feeding of the 5,000. Yeah, who would have thought? That's the only one that they have in common. And it kind of like ties them together. It's before the final year of Jesus' ministry. He feeds the 5,000 near the Sea of Galilee. And what do we find out about the passage? What is the unique thing that John says about that miracle that the others did not say? It's in John chapter 6, verse 14 and 15. After the people saw this sign that Jesus had performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. And then you have the following story where when he's praying on the mountain, the disciples get in the boat and go across, and it's in the storm, and Jesus walks on the water and so forth. And we know that part of the story. But what we don't realize is that it was at the feeding of the 5,000 that Jesus made it very clear that he did not come to set up an earthly kingdom. And for Romans, that was a big deal, because they were like, just like Americans, hey, we're the empire of the world kind of thing, no competitors. And Jesus makes it very clear that they were going to force him to become king in a worldly sense, and he refused it. And that's very uniquely John, because we're talking about this invisible, eternal kingdom that the others allude to, but in this one, that is the distinctive. And he's thinking, those other three guys, when they wrote the Gospels, they left this part out. I think we probably ought to know that. So, Israel knew they were to bring the Messiah to the world. In John chapter 1, verses 10 to 12, it says, and I read NIV, he says, John is writing about the Word. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, that is, his own people, his own nation. But his own did not receive him. And that is sad. We wouldn't want to be that. We wouldn't want that the most important person that we'd ever anticipated coming to our home, we do not receive them. But this is the great verse. Billy Graham Crusade used this, verse 12. Other evangelists have used it, and it still rings so true. But it's just think about, John was writing to people that didn't necessarily know that they could be equals with those who had been born into the kingdom, so to speak, like Jewish Christians. And that's how they would have viewed it. We know that's not true, but that's how they would have viewed it. And yet, to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right or authority to become children of God. That's a memorizing verse right there, just in case you're wondering. Now, I had a really tough discipler when I was a 17-year-old, and he was going to make me really grow quick and do some quick, kind of like supercharge that transformation of this kid. And this was one of those verses that I had to memorize. And so don't look at memorizing some verses as a burden. Find that one that resonates in your soul and learn it. Just repeat it. Just find ways to get that in your mind. And that John wrote, and the video that we saw earlier showed us that he wrote so that people could believe. That was his purpose. He said, these things are written that you can believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you'll have life in his name. And if nothing else, that's John chapter 20, verse 30 and 31. That is why we're here, that we may have life in his name. Not that we have more knowledge of the Bible. That's not the purpose of this 10 weeks. The purpose of this 10 weeks is to have life. And Jesus said himself in John chapter 10, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. Depends on the translation. Life indeed. That is his call. And it's not just simply this physical life, and it's not just simply being, anything other than the transformed renewal of our own souls. And that's what we can pursue as we study this gospel together. Everyone who believes has life in his name. That's the last word of John's gospel. And that's why all of this matters so much. It bridges the gap for the Jewish story to the non-Jewish people. It is the gospel written for us. I always like to remind people, at least me, I'm totally Gentile. You know, I'm not a Jew. And so when I read John, I'm going, this is written for me. I don't understand Jewish stuff like from culture and from custom. I only know it because I went to, did studies and stuff, but I didn't know it because I was raised in it. And so for us, we are thinkers, just like the Greeks were. We are skeptics, just like the Greeks were. We are hedonists, just like the Greeks were. And we are seekers, just like the Greeks were. You'll find in the gospel, I'm not even going to tell you where it is, but there was a group of Greeks that came seeking Jesus and came to Andrew. Look for it as you're reading. So the Word became flesh, summarizes those narratives, and we move on and look at this John is not just the disciple that Jesus loved. He and his brother James were called sons of thunder. In other words, they were hotheads. I don't particularly like hotheads myself. As a kid, I was intimidated by them, and now I'm just annoyed by them. But that was them. Two of Jesus' disciples were hotheads, the sons of thunder. Bold, sometimes reckless, but that's okay. John, at one point, in John chapter 4, he wanted to call fire down on the Samaritan village just because they wouldn't welcome Jesus. Well, that's a little extreme, really. But he was close to Jesus, rough around the edges, relatable, human. He was one of the inner circle. You can know it if you ever have done much reading. Who are the three closest to Jesus? Peter, James, and John. And they were the three that got to do a lot of things that the other disciples didn't get to see. They were the three that Jesus brought into the Garden of Gethsemane with him to watch and pray. And so John was in this position of seeing some things about Jesus that he shares with us all these centuries later. And so let's do a walkthrough very quickly through the rest of John chapter 1. The video kind of did a little bit of that already, but I just want to kind of get this with you, and I'm going to just kind of breeze through some things out of my own Bible here. And so we already know the first verse, but then we get to verse 6, and it says, verse 5 says, the light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it. And I would say that light and darkness are two of your key words. In fact, I would challenge you to use like maybe some type of marking system in your Bible, and digitally, you can do the same thing in a digital Bible, even on your online Bibles. You can do this. You can make your own notes and make some highlights and stuff like that. Look for the handful of key words in the Gospel of John, and it will help you to know bigger about what his picture is. And light and darkness are two of them. There are two of those words. So look for more of them. I'm not going to give them all to you. It's not like you're taking notes for a test. You want to discover them yourselves, but find those themes. Now, I would cheat on this, not that I recommend it. I would cheat because I didn't want to have to read the whole gospel again, when I was in my 40s and 50s, when I finally had digital Bible. And so I'd make a document like all the book of John. That's the big copy, but I did it. And then I would just do word searches, find this word. And then when I'd hit one that had like 20 something, you just bingo, you hit highlight, and all of those would be highlighted in the one that I had. Now I think that's cheating, but it's a tool, so use it. But as you are reading in your Bible, underline, use some type of marking to help you to notice, because those themes don't necessarily transform your life today, but cumulatively, your understanding and therefore your application of it to your life will grow as you begin to understand more and more about what John was really trying to get across to all of us. So that's in that first section there. And then we notice that there are the prophets. John is mentioned, and it is there came a man who was sent from God. His name was John. And he came to witness and testify. And you've read this maybe already, a little, in the last few days. And we begin to see that John has a comparison to Elijah. And in the Gospel of John, we continue to see that. And so notice that. See the significance of that. And we get to where in John chapter 3, there's a significant reveal about John the Baptist. And it is alluded to right here in the first place. And so he came as a witness to the light The light is one of our key words. And then we keep moving through here, and it tells us again about the true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world. That was John's message. And he was in the world, that is the light, and through the world was made through him. Though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him, did not recognize Jesus, did not recognize the Messiah. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. And yet to all who received him and who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. That's kind of like one of those high points in that chapter. And I have to think, okay, so how is the rest of this supporting this aspect of this? And so the word, verse 14, kind of picks up again from the first verse where he says, the word became flesh. And that is so important. Made his dwelling among us, and we know that Jesus lived among us. And that message is echoed through the epistles. It's echoed through the book of Acts. When Peter was explaining to Cornelius, the first clearly Roman convert to Christianity, and Peter said to him, and Jesus went through this life doing good for those in need. And so this dwelling is described even more so in the Bible. And so when we see that word dwelling, we have to ask ourselves, how did Jesus dwell in this life? And then we need to ask ourselves, which is kind of like coming to like the final part of Bible study. I need to then ask myself, how am I dwelling and how am I doing at being a representation of Jesus in this world? Because we know not from John's gospel so much, but from the rest of the Bible, that we are indwelled by the Spirit of Christ, and we are the body of Christ. And that's why we are giving ourselves to this kind of study, so that we can not just behave like a good church, to behave like we're part of the body of Christ, but to actually continue that transformation, that full experience of becoming in our character and in our spirit a good representation of what Jesus would be in this world. So you're going to have some, that's where I'm going to stop, because I want to give you time here to do some other stuff as groups. There are some implications that you need to think about as you go off to group discussion. Lindsay, are you going to share these? You going to share some questions? Okay, I think maybe I'll just leave that to Lindsay then. But what I want you to just stop and think about is, I don't have to become a Bible scholar in 10 weeks, but I can embrace being transformed by the power of the Word of Christ now. So glad to be here with you tonight. God bless you as your groups are growing. Invite people to your groups. Even at this stage, invite and have people come together to experience this great opportunity of spiritual growth.
All right. So John 1 has quite a bit to cover, as you can tell. And I just don't want you to get overwhelmed either. You're going to have time to talk through some of this with your group. And if you're like, I don't know any of this, I need to read my Bible more. That's what we hope that you do, that we want you in the Word. We want you reading through John to understand it better, because Tony had a lot of great points that just point us closer to Jesus. So as we read Scripture, it's not to have the knowledge, it's to be transformed. So I have a couple of questions that I have. I should have texted all the leaders. If the leaders don't have them, you might want to write them down or have a group member do that. But there's going to be 2 questions that we send you off with. So the first is, what does John 1 tell you about who Jesus is, and what does it mean to be children of God? So that's the first question that you're going to discuss in your groups tonight. So the second one is, which disciple do you relate with at the end of John 1? So if you didn't have time to read, just even tonight, just read that last section in John 1 with your group to discuss that before you head into that question. So the first is, what does John 1 tell you about who Jesus is, and what does it mean to be children of God? And 2, which disciple do you relate with at the end of John 1? But what we want you to do now, and I've kind of prepped some of the group leaders, is we want to have time for you to connect with your groups. So some of you are new and you're like, I don't know who my group leader is. And some of you have been in the same group for a little while and you know your group really well. So we want to make sure to have everyone kind of huddle up tonight, talk through those questions, but also talk through, if you are new, like, make sure you know where you're meeting next week and what day and time, just some of those logistics, and then just get to know some of your group as well, and have it. Especially for the new groups, make sure you have time to share and just a little bit about yourselves. So what I'm going to do is, because there are so many new folks, is I'm going to have the leaders, you don't have to come on stage. If the leaders can just come to the front and stand here, I'm going to point out leader, I'll say their name, and then I'll send them out. So we don't have enough meeting space for everyone because there's a lot of you, and it's a very big building, no meeting space. So what we'll do is I'll send you out, and you'll just